I'm Vanessa Lynch and I'm the founder of the DNA Project. The DNA Project is a non-profit organization which I started after the murder of my father in 2004. The loss of evidence at his crime scene motivated me to start the organization so that we could utilize DNA evidence in South Africa for crime resolution and to connect criminals to their crime. And the most important drive that we have going with the DNA Project is to change legislation that mandates that arrestees and convicted offenders have their DNA samples taken and the profiles uploaded to a database so that we can connect criminals to their crime no matter how long and when they're arrested. So that's essentially the objectives of the DNA Project. The DNA Project has been lobbying government for the last 10 years to pass legislation that makes it compulsory for arrestees and convicted offenders to have their DNA submitted. We do have a forensic science infrastructure. We have 2 laboratories that have always been using forensic science and DNA on a case-by-case basis, but not doing anything with those profiles. So the law essentially allows us to expand the DNA database in South Africa. And by doing so, the high rate of recidivism in South Africa, the reoffending rate, will hopefully be reduced because we have criminals that are not committing one crime per criminal. It's a series of crimes. And by putting their profiles onto the database, it just ensures that in future, should they commit further crimes, you can obviously come down on them at a much earlier stage. So the resolution really comes into effect because there's accountability. Currently, people are literally getting away with murder. In my father's case, to this day, they haven't found the people who murdered him. And that's because there was loss of evidence at the crime scene. There was no methodology to collect those samples and put them onto a database. Even if those people were arrested 10 years down the line, we could still connect them back to the crime. So hoping going forward, although there are going to be many challenges, we will get to a point where we will be able to identify criminals and therefore make them accountable for their actions. The challenges we face going forward are numerous. The Act, we are hoping, is not going to be a paper tiger in that it looks good on paper, but it needs to translate into crime resolution. Some of the challenges we face right now is that whilst the Act has been passed, it's not yet operational. That's because the police still have to be trained to take DNA samples from arrestees and convicted offenders. Currently, it's being done by medical officers and registered nurses because they are taking blood. The new Act allows police officers to take a buccal or a cheek swab, and until such time as enough officers have been trained to do that, we're not going to be taking samples from the convicted offenders and arrestees. So the President will declare that Act operational when he feels there are enough officers in place that have been trained to take the samples. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is crime scene awareness, right down from the first responding officer up to the magistrates and prosecutors. There is not enough awareness in South Africa around the value of forensic evidence, the fact that it can be so easily contaminated by virtue of people going onto a crime scene when they shouldn't be there, or not collecting DNA evidence, which is such a critical link to connecting the person to the crime. So until such time as we have enough crime scene awareness programs in place, which is something that the DNA Project does, we are going to continuously lose evidence at the crime scene. So you can have the best laws in place, you can have everybody trained, and you can have a fantastic forensic infrastructure, but if you are not collecting evidence at the crime scene, you will never get off the starting blocks. The reason I started this and the reason I identified where the issues were, and I take you back to my father's case because it's quite important because it creates the platform of why I do what I do, is that in his particular case, there was a plethora of evidence that was left on the crime scene. The perpetrators had climbed over the fence and they had cut themselves on the razor wire. They had been drinking brandy and coke in the garden before they broke into the home. There was a struggle between my father, who was fighting for his life and protecting my mother, and the crime scene in itself would have had a lot of transfer of evidence because of the struggle that took place. When 2 weeks later the crime scene investigators closed the file in front of me and said, "We will never get these guys, we're closing the case," I asked them, "Where's the evidence?" And when I went back and looked why they hadn't collected any evidence, it was due to a number of reasons. The first is that they had thrown the bottle away because they said we didn't have the technology to uplift DNA evidence from the bottle. We did have it at the time, but it was a lack of education. The crime scene itself, by the time we got back from the hospital, because my father had survived a few hours, had been cleaned up by family, friends and neighbours, because they didn't want us to be offended by the devastation that had obviously occurred there. But in so doing, they had desecrated the crime scene, and any trace of evidence that could possibly have been left behind was therefore taken away. The blood on the fence was never collected, and there was inclement weather thereafter, and that opportunity was lost. My father's clothing, where there would have been a lot of transfer of evidence, simply disappeared. Whether the paramedics threw it away, whether the hospital threw it away, not understanding the value, we were never able to collect that and see whether there had been a transfer of evidence. The autopsy, the pathologists never took swabs from under his fingernails, from his body, where he was fighting for his life. So you can see that right down from the community all the way up to the professionals, there was this lack of evidence that was being collected. And when I looked at that and I understood that not only do we have this amazing technology called DNA that we need to utilize to its best advantage in a country where we have 150 murders per day, we needed not only to create better crime scene awareness, but we needed to have legislation that enabled us to use it to connect people to their crimes. And that's why I identified crime scene awareness and education as a huge objective, and the passing of legislation. And obviously it took a while, and it still has. It's work in progress. We've trained over 30,000 people to date, ranging from magistrates to prosecutors, right down to school children, in the value of forensic DNA profiling, the value of crime scene preservation. And it also took a long time just to get into government. It took me 4 years before the First Minister would listen to me in 2008. And then it took 5 years through Parliament before they passed the legislation, before they recognised that this was something that needed to be done. So it has been a journey.